Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This is the Thursday edition of Point of View. In this first hour today, we're going to look at a couple of issues in the news, especially the hurricane that has crashed into the shores there in Texas and primarily in Louisiana. And then Charles Mizrahi will be with us. We're going to be talking about kind of the biblical roots of capitalism, a piece that he has posted. A very successful investor over these years, but also took time in the midst of educating many of us about how to evaluate stocks and companies and things of that nature, to also address the issue of capitalism and the idea of capitalism leading to generosity and a variety of other things. So we'll spend some time with him and then get back into the news. Next hour, we'll talk about everything from Encourage TV to a little bit more looking at what took place at the third night of the Republican National Convention. And then in the last hour, Dr. Larry Crabb, of course, author of so many books, Inside Out, probably the best known, but his new book, Waiting for Heaven, will be our conversation. And of course, we'll be looking tonight for the fourth and final night of the Republican Convention, when we'll hear from the President, Donald Trump, and a number of other speakers, which I will mention later in the broadcast. Okay, Hurricane Laura pounded the Gulf Coast, and in some respects, perhaps the most significant and strongest hurricane ever. You didn't necessarily get that because there's been a lot of focus on other things. In terms of the destruction, we'll see how bad it was, but in terms of the wind speed of 150 miles per hour, for those of you that are listening from other parts of the world, that would be under 240 kilometers per hour. And Louisiana took the brunt of it as it barreled over Lake Charles and really began to affect an industrial area, a casino city of about 80,000 people, and even some low-lying fishing communities. To give you an idea of what it's like when you get hit by a Cat 4 storm, this wall of seawater, they predicted, may have gone 40 miles inland. I mean, it's just even hard to imagine what that is like. And again, lots of destruction. But so far, at least the news I have, one fatality, which is sad, but a 14-year-old girl died when a tree fell on her home in Leesville, which is really more than 100 miles inland. But as one person put it there, the devastation looks like 1,000 tornadoes went through here, destruction everywhere. As a matter of fact, some people that wrote it out, which they weren't supposed to do, said that the house sounded like a jet engine roared right over the head of them, and some of the houses are totally gone. Some of these, even tall buildings, have had all the windows knocked out and glass and debris. So we'll talk more about that maybe next hour. But in some respects, as devastating as that will be as a hurricane, in terms of loss of life and some of the other disruptions that have happened in other hurricanes, we may not put that in the top 10 list, but we will see, because now people are trying to make sense of what has taken place. Did not, before we went any further, try to ignore the third night of the Republican National Convention. We've tried to give you some coverage each night. And the theme certainly seemed to be in the first night, Donald Trump is not a racist. Some of that surfaced again. Some of it on Tuesday night seemed to be saying he's not xenophobic because of various things talking about immigrants. The theme last night, at least part, seemed to be women, because you had the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, who gave a very powerful speech about heroes and opposing the mob. You had Senator Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee giving a warning about the radical left. You had Elise Stefanik, who is a representative out of New York, talking about the American dream. Of course, you had White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany telling her own story about mastectomy. You had the second lady, Karen Pence, talking about the 19th Amendment, and Kellyanne Conway noting that Donald Trump has elevated women to senior positions in business and government. And in matter of fact, she said, for many of us, women's empowerment is not a slogan. It comes from strangers on social media, sanitized language in a corporate handbook. It comes from everyday heroes who nurture us, who actually shape us and believe in us. Kellyanne Conway went on to say, I was raised in a household of all women. They were self-reliant and resilient, and their lives were not easy. Money was tight, but we had an abundance of what mattered most: family, faith, and freedom. And then you also had Laura Trump, who is married to Eric Trump, speak to the whole issue and talked about, if nothing else, she began to realize how the president really did elevate women, because he came to her asking her to maybe help reach North Carolina. Talked about under the president's leadership, women's unemployment hit the lowest level since World War II. 4.3 million new jobs have been created for women in 2009 alone, and women took over 70% of those new jobs. I think she did a pretty good job, but guess what? The only article that I could find, at least on the Drudge Report, that talked about all these women was about Laura Trump. And what was it about? That she had a quote from Abraham Lincoln that Abraham Lincoln didn't say. Really? Matter of fact, I even looked it up, because the link goes then to, you can go to Snopes, you can go to PolitiFact. Turns out that Abraham Lincoln didn't say that quote that's been used quite a bit by a lot of people over the last couple of weeks, but he did say something close to it. And if that doesn't give you an illustration of how poorly the press, that is the mainstream kind of liberal press, has covered this, how many women spoke, especially in light of just the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment? And the only article you could see was one that was critical of a quote by Laura Trump of Abraham Lincoln, which I'm not minimizing. Sometimes, of course, the quotes that are attributed to Blaise Pascal, to Abraham Lincoln, to George Washington, a number of others sometimes are erroneous. And from time to time, I try to do a fact check on it just so we don't keep repeating erroneous ones. But it, I think, tells you a lot about how poorly the press really covered the convention even last night. And I thought, just as a footnote, one of the speakers last night was Chen Guangcheng. And if you've ever listened to Point of View, you know that many times we have Reggie Littlejohn on the program. And Reggie Littlejohn, over the years, before he was actually freed, she actually talked about him as a human rights activist. Then, of course, he was freed. She spent time with him as well. And he was brought just to remind everybody that we do have an enemy. It's called China. He said, standing up to tyranny is not easy. I know. When I spoke against China's one-child policy and other injustices, I was persecuted, beaten, and put under house arrest by the government. Tells about how he was able to gain freedom. And he said the Chinese Communist Party is an enemy of humanity. It is terrorizing its own people. It is threatening the well-being of the world. In China, expressing beliefs or ideas not approved by the Chinese Communist Party, that is religion, democracy, human rights, can lead to prison. The nation lives under mass surveillance and censorship. So anyway, if you happened to watch it last night, and I know most of you probably did not, because this has not exactly been a ratings bonanza, either the Democratic National Convention or the Republican Convention. But if you did, and you saw that blind Chinese activist, it is somebody that we've talked about many times with Reggie Littlejohn right here on the program. We're going to take a break, and we're going to talk a little bit about capitalism and socialism and some of that. And then we'll come back and focus on the other parts of the Republican National Convention, because lots of conversation last night about civil rights and, of course, a very important speech by the Vice President, Mike Pence. But we need to take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Why do rioters in the streets have so much rage? Trying to find rational answers to irrational actions is often a worthless endeavor. But Ned Ryan has found some reasons for the misdirected rage of young rioters. His recent column parallels some of the insights from the book The Coddling of the American Mind that I've discussed in previous commentaries. He notes that many of the rioters come from a spoiled, enabled, and poorly educated generation or two. He says we shouldn't be surprised when we see them looting, rioting, and tearing down statues. Some of this, he believes, goes back to the self-esteem movement of the 1990s when children were told that they were best, even when they weren't. They grew up where everyone got participation trophies. Add to the fact that they spent years at indoctrination centers of higher learning where they were spoon-fed all the lies about how evil our country is, that it is a place rotten to the core, and that it should be burned to the ground. But then they graduate from schools with worthless degrees and staggering debt. They can't find jobs, so they rage against the system. They blame the free market capitalist system. Ned Ryan understands their anger, but believes it is misplaced. They rage against a version of capitalism implemented by corporations. He says that what we have today is crony capitalist system filled with vulture capitalists who manipulate markets and politics to their advantage. They want to burn capitalism and the American society down, but they need to focus their targets and pay closer attention. Their rage, unfortunately, stems from the miseducation they received in school, coupled with the real concerns about crony capitalism that is misdirected at the free market. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you've been listening to Point of View any length of time, you know that I have a booklet on capitalism and socialism. I've written about this in various books dealing with economics. And of course, we've had all sorts of guests on the program talking about the free market and some of those benefits. And I thought this would be just another opportunity to think about this. So the first article we've posted here is Prosperity and Generosity, the Biblical Roots of Capitalism. It is written by Charles Mizrahi, who is an individual that first started trading on the New York Futures Exchange at the age of 20, has been involved in recommending stocks. Those of you that maybe watch some of the videos, I've seen some of the videos, I think the Alpha Investor videos, if I remember right, in which he was talking about how you can evaluate stocks by looking at and evaluating companies. He has taught investing at New York University School of Continuing and Professional Studies, also the founding editor of Park Avenue Investment Club and the editor of the Insider Alert Advisory Services, to mention just a few. So, Charles, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. Thank you so much for having me.
You know, we know you as a guy to actually maybe go to learn about stocks, and I certainly appreciate the work that you've done there. But I was heartened to see this two-page article that appeared in Real Clear Religion. We've posted it for our listeners to read. But in some respects, this was also very helpful because at a time when especially the younger you are, the less likely you are to be a fan of capitalism or the free market, we need to come back and really begin to educate some people about what the capitalist system is and what it is not and how it fits with biblical ideas, don't we?
Absolutely. That's really that was the motivation for me to write this article, Kerby. It was just boiling my blood listening to so many, really I shouldn't say so many, a vocal minority decry that capitalism is the root of all evil. Capitalism is a problem, and the problem for everything going wrong in this country. And they couldn't be further from the truth or the facts than they are. And I sat down and I penned this article basically to remind people of what a great country this is and how it is the land of opportunity, and our form of government, our system of government, our system of taxation, and the opportunity this country fosters and really just the people thrive within it. That's not something to take lightly. That's not something to say we want a failed system that enslaved millions of people and killed close to 100 million people in the 20th century. Wake up.
Yes, and again, just the other day, we were talking about this whole idea of the legacy of Karl Marx, and that's where that number comes from. And a lot of it has to do with this belief right now out there on the streets, and you've run into it, Charles, that the only way to raise people out of poverty is to have government programs. And yet I still think that the best poverty program, the best anti-poverty program, probably a better way to say it, or the best program to lift people out of poverty is a job. And jobs come by investment and various kinds of generosity and prosperity. And that's really kind of the theme of your article, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you. The way someone is lifted out of poverty, but lifted out of poverty not only in the sense of changing his economic status or her economic status, but giving a person dignity is by giving them work, making them a productive member of society. There is no greater dignity in work of any kind, as long as you're a productive member of society. And people who have ever been unemployed know exactly what I'm talking about. You feel terrible. You feel you're not contributing. You feel there's something wrong with you. You become despondent, regardless of what those checks come for the unemployment insurance. Put that all aside. You don't feel like a person. You lose your dignity. There is no greater dignity than work. And the people who create these jobs are not wealthy people in many cases. Small businesses aren't wealthy people. These are people with courage. These are people who have confidence and are willing to risk it all, because we live in a system, in a society that promotes opportunity, that is fertile ground to get a business license, to open up a corporation. You don't need government approval in many cases. You don't need years and years of paperwork. I remember reading one time in Egypt, I think it was 10 to 12 years of paperwork and government nightmare in order to get a license to open a retail store. And you think of what we can do here today. You don't even have to open a store, but just online how you could create a business. So the government, where does it work? Where does it work when government assistance lifts people out of poverty permanently? It should act as a small safety net for those that really need it. And once they get on their feet, be proud to walk off and contribute back to society, not be sustained by a government. I don't want to be a vassal of the state. Why would anyone want that?
Well, again, Charles Mizrahi with us as we are talking about this piece, Prosperity and Generosity, the Biblical Roots of Capitalism, appeared in Real Clear Religion. We have a link on our website, pointofview.net. And you know, Charles, the whole government was established as a republic. And at the same time, there was also kind of an assumption of free market, because in 1776, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. And there was also kind of this assumption of a Judeo-Christian set of values. So let's talk about, for just a few minutes in your article, some of the biblical principles which we see in the Old Testament. And you start with one of those, recognizing that for Abraham and many others in the Old Testament theocracy, wealth and prosperity were signs of blessing from God. And so you see that in Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Solomon, and others. And so in some respects, if somebody is wealthy, we should not envy them, which is what is sort of taught today in a lot of our universities. We should maybe admire them and maybe aspire to do something similar. Is that fair?
Absolutely. You know, the Jewish Bible, it basically talks about wealth as a responsibility. Wealth to accumulate and to hoard was never the ideal. In fact, just the opposite. In Deuteronomy, for example, in chapter 15, the Bible was very aware that there is going to be in society, there are going to be those who have and those who don't. And it specifically says, there will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. So with wealth comes responsibility to take care of those who can't take care of themselves, not to take them and tell them not to work ever again and we'll support you. Absolutely not. To help the underbelly of society, specifically the widow, who in a male-dominated society, it was very difficult for a woman without a husband, an orphan without parents, the resident alien, the stranger who had no social network in the land. Those are the ones that could be taken advantage of, and there was no one to cry out for them. So the Bible instituted fair practices, in a sense, to take care of these people. So in an agrarian society, if you had a field, in Leviticus 19, it talks about leaving the corners of your field, the portion of that crop that has to be standing, there for the poor. Gleanings, when the ears of grain would fall from the reaper's hand or the sickle while the grain is being gathered during the harvest, you can't retrieve them. Those are for the widow, orphan, and the resident alien. The book of Ruth is all about that, right? She goes into Boaz's field in order to go behind the reaper, and that's what she brings back as her food to Naomi. So the whole concept of wealth for wealth's sake is an alien one. Right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about when you accumulate wealth, see it as a blessing from the Almighty, and then take that wealth and make society better and take care of those who can't take care of themselves.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to continue the conversation, and I would encourage you to find this article very well written, and it may take you into some of these other passages which we haven't talked about in Ezekiel and Deuteronomy and some of the others that you will find helpful, and it really gets into this whole idea of generosity. You might remember a while back that we've had Arthur Brooks on this program before, and years ago he wrote a book called Who Really Cares? What he found out is the people that tend to be the most generous, the people that tend to give, tend to be the more conservative individuals, the more religious individuals, and it isn't just in terms of giving to their church or synagogue, or it isn't just giving to Christian organizations or even philanthropic organizations. They even concluded that if liberals gave blood at the level that conservatives give blood, we wouldn't have a blood shortage. So in some respects, we're going to come back and talk about what does God command and even expect in terms of generosity, and then let's look maybe a little bit at some of the founders of this country. What did they particularly suggest? And if you find yourself saying, oh, this is a really nice piece, I might like to read that, might send it to my niece, nephew, son, daughter, maybe friend that is convinced that capitalism is so awful, you might really enjoy this piece on prosperity and generosity, the biblical roots of capitalism. We've talked about the prosperity part. When we come back, we'll talk about the generosity part, and I think you're going to really enjoy the piece that we've posted there for you to use, and I would encourage you to take the time to put it on your Facebook page or send it out as a Twitter post. Get some conversation started, and we will continue our conversation right after these important messages.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Charles Mizrahi for just a few more minutes. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or else just sit back and listen to some of the conversation we're having about his article, Prosperity and Generosity, the Biblical Roots of Capitalism. It is on our website, pointofview.net. And if you'd like to know more about him, we also have a link to charlesmizrahiguru.com. Now, again, you don't have to know how to spell all that. Simply go to pointofview.net, click on that. It tells his story, which is really quite an interesting story of growing up in Brooklyn and how he's been so successful there on Main Street and Wall Street. And at the same time, you can find out more about his Alpha Investor if you would want to do so. So a lot of great material that we have posted on our website, pointofview.net. Well, Charles, we've been talking about prosperity. Let's get back into this issue of generosity. And you make a good case. God himself shows generosity. And so in some respects, if we want to follow the example of our Lord and of God, then we should be generous people as well, shouldn't we?
Well, absolutely. And the point that I want to make is, this is so important, Kerby, is the Founding Fathers got this. They based this country on Judeo-Christian values. And throughout history of the United States, it was the American people have always been the most generous on the planet. It is the American people that after World War I feed Europe after it's devastated. Woodrow Wilson, president, sends over Herbert Hoover, and he's responsible for feeding tens of millions, over 15 million children, giving them food. We did the same thing after World War II with the Marshall Plan. Europe's devastated. Once again, we provide. Who does that? Who provides food and rebuilds the cities for their enemies? And the American people are givers. Total giving to charitable organization was close to $410 billion in 2017. And the most amazing thing I found about that is that individuals accounted for 70% of all giving.
Yes.
So the ethos of giving and caring and being generous is embedded in the American citizen in our country. We're the first to help nations that are in distress. And that didn't come from nowhere. It doesn't exist from nowheresville. It came from a philosophy and an approach and a way of life that is part of the American fabric.
And one of the things that you mentioned just in passing, but let me come back to it because it's in your article, the founders, how they understood this. And for example, you point out that George Washington, on more than one occasion, quotes from the prophet Micah when talking about peace and prosperity. As an individual that has at least one of my graduate degrees from Georgetown University studying American political theory, I can tell you that I could go through a pretty long list of people that have been part of our founding, whether it was Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, as well as many that perhaps are not as well known, like Benjamin Rush and others, that all really emphasize this idea of generosity. So in some respects, this started at the very beginning. We were not a wealthy nation when it first began. We were a colonial power that had just been really losing most of its financial resources in fighting an American Revolution. And then we were under these Articles of Confederation, and eventually then we have a Constitution. And yet still the emphasis was on generosity. The emphasis was on helping your fellow man and doing what you can to make a difference. And so in some respects, the ideas that we inherited today, even in the 21st century, go all the way back to the 18th century, don't they?
Absolutely. Young people today forget that George Washington was a surveyor. And the reason he was a surveyor is he had so much land holdings from his family and from his, as you know, I don't have to tell you, from his wife's family as well, Martha Custis. And they were very wealthy. Benjamin Franklin retires at around 40 years old, yes. A very wealthy man, and he gives back to society with his inventions, with his diplomacy, and his skills. In fact, Benjamin Franklin writes that only rich people should serve in government because they won't be tainted by bribes and other temptations and will do the right thing. So it's interesting. The founding fathers were very practical people, amazing human beings, understood the human condition, and created a framework of opportunity with freedom that the end result, it works. We are the most generous people on the face of the earth. Our country is one of the strongest in terms of our economic power of $22 or $23 trillion in GDP, and $1 trillion and $2 trillion companies are right here in our own backyard. Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon. They didn't grow up in the Soviet Union or North Korea or Cuba, but right here in the United States. Why is that possible? How is it possible? It's because of the culture of the whole system that was created and handed over to each generation, made a little bit better. And to say that capitalism is the problem, I don't think they're evil. I just think they're misguided.
And as a matter of fact, my commentary today is about misdirected rage, because it kind of gets into this idea that when I talk to young people, they get upset about not necessarily capitalism or a free market, but what might be crony capitalism, which is oftentimes where unfair advantages are granted to one corporation over another. And so it hasn't actually been a free market and hasn't been a clean plains, an open playing field. And so in some respects, we need to come back to some of the things that you end your piece on in terms of hard work, investment, even thrift. I mean, the word thrift sometimes isn't even mentioned anymore. And we used to be a nation of savers. We now seem to be a nation in debt. So there are some very important economic principles from the Bible that we should apply today, aren't there?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that's what has driven me. I managed money for a lot of rich people, a lot of rich corporations, made them a lot of money. And about 15 years ago, I decided to give, and I started to write newsletters, really taking Wall Street information and bringing it to Main Street. And what motivated me to do that was, growing up, my father was a warehouse manager. We were pretty middle class at best. And my father and mother put us through school, through scholarships, through private school. And life wasn't easy. I do remember how difficult it was, especially growing up in the inflationary period of the 70s and the double-digit unemployment and double-digit interest rates. It was extremely hard to put food on the table. It wasn't easy. And I just look back and think, if someone approached my father and told him something about how to make money by investing in great companies like Berkshire Hathaway, General Motors, or IBM, how different life would have been than him putting money into a savings account thinking that was investing. So what I started doing is I started writing the Alpha Investor Report, and I basically write it for Main Street Americans. I write it so anyone can understand. And I just want to offer your listeners to go onto the site, alphainvestornow.com. Mm-hmm. All they need to do is enter their email address. I give them a free 30-day subscription to the newsletter. They can watch all the videos, the ones that you mentioned. There is no catch. There is no credit card. alphainvestornow.com, because my point is that I want to focus now on Main Street Americans to show them how to take back their financial future in these trying times, and remember, and more importantly, rekindle the American dream, because there's opportunity all around us. One just has to put on their glasses and look around and, holy smokes, I don't see devastation. I see opportunity. And that's why I'm extremely optimistic for the next several years for this country.
Let me just mention, too, if you go to charlesmizrahguru.com, also at the top there, you can click on that and get that free subscription. So we have that link already established on our website, pointofview.net. So if you're driving right now, didn't have a chance to write all that down, all you simply need to do is go to pointofview.net. And, of course, we've appreciated the fact that you have really been on the forefront all these years doing investments. And so I was heartened to see that you wrote this very good piece on prosperity and generosity, the biblical roots of capitalism. Hope you'll do it again, and hope you come on Point of View again sometime in the future.
Kerby, thank you so much, and I greatly appreciate the great message you're spreading out there, and especially the focus that you're having of young people to just really direct them back to what they should have been taught in college, but for whatever reason, they weren't.
Well, again, we will continue to do that here at Point of View. Of course, I have that booklet on capitalism and socialism and some other things that we will always be glad to make available to you. It's one of the benefits, by the way, if you are a supporter of Point of View. So many of you have already received that booklet or one of the other ones that I write each month in the mail. So find out more about that as well. But we're going to take a break. When we come back, I sort of stopped talking about what was happening in day 3 of the Republican convention, and I thought there were just a couple other points, especially when we had some civil rights activists, as well as an individual who has always said I was a Democrat, but have decided to support Trump. In some respects, many people think his particular speech, Jack Brewer's, might have been one of the best. And so a lot of these caught us off guard, so we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me talk about the, again, third night of the Republican convention last night. And one of the themes that ran through at least two of the speakers was the old issue of civil rights. Now, in some respects, they sort of covered a little of that. Is Donald Trump a racist on Monday? And I had some people specifically address that. But then, more to the point, what about people that believe in civil rights or are concerned about Black Lives Matter and those kinds of issues? And so there was a real attempt, at least with two speakers, both African American, as you might imagine, to address that. The first was Clarence Henderson, who is a veteran of the 1960s civil rights movement, which makes him a lot older because I remember during the 1960s, I was still pretty much of a kid, even as I had neighbors that were going to Selma, Alabama to march and those kinds of things. But nevertheless, he was one of those individuals I want to quote from. And then we'll get to what many people think was the best speech of the night. And that one came out of the blue. Former NFL star Jack Brewer. So we'll get to that in a minute. Leader of Black Voices for Trump. And I've been very unfamiliar with him, but we will certainly learn more about him in the future. But let me go first of all to Clarence Henderson, who actually was involved in the civil rights movement. And many of those people are getting much older, and we're probably going to lose many of them, just as we've lost so many of the World War II veterans. And he said 60 years ago, segregation was legal and enforced. The simple act of sitting at a lunch counter could lead to physical harm, jail time, or worse. He says, I know that from personal experience. I'm sure he does. By sitting down to order a cup of coffee, we challenged injustice. We knew it was necessary, but we didn't know what would happen. Then he talks about a little bit later, we faced down the KKK, that'd be the Ku Klux Klan. We were cursed and called all kinds of names. They threatened to kill us, and some of us were arrested, but it was worth it. Our actions inspired similar protests throughout the South against racial injustice. In the end, segregation was abolished, and the country moved a step closer to true equality for all. Now, I might just mention Clarence Henderson actually represented himself as a graduate of HBCU, in other words, the historically black colleges, a military veteran, a civil rights activist, and now a Republican who supports Donald Trump. And basically he says, well, the fact that I'm supporting Donald Trump, if that sounds strange to you, he said, learn your history. I love this. It was the Republican Party that passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. It was the Republican Party that passed the 14th Amendment, giving black men citizenship. And it was the Republican Party that passed the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote. And so, again, he spent some time trying to educate people about that issue. And then that turns us to another individual who now is probably going to get much more press simply because he is part of what they call them blacks for Trump. And that is an individual who played in the NFL, Jack Brewer. Many people think he gave the best speech of the night. And that's saying something because this has really been pretty good speeches overall. He certainly talked on the issue of whether Republicans are racist. And again, he starts out by talking about his own father's experience since he is younger. He says, I remember my dad's bravery when he personally stood up against the KKK rally, that again be Ku Klux Klan, in my town. In my house, my father taught me to back down from no one. I know what racism looks like. I've seen it firsthand in America. It has no resemblance to President Trump, and I'm fed up with the way he's portrayed in the media, who refuse to acknowledge what he's actually done for the black community. So you might say, what is that? And of course, he goes through the list that you've heard us mention here before. So then he sort of is speaking now to African Americans who might have tuned in. Sadly, I hope this gets more press. As a matter of fact, even past a YouTube video, or I guess it was one from the Hill, of this so people can pass it around, because there were a lot of people that maybe are African American that think they need to vote for Joe Biden, and he really takes them on in this particular quote. Because he said, are we so offended by the president's campaign slogan, Make America Great Again, that we're going to ignore that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have collectively been responsible for locking up countless black men for nonviolent crimes? Are you going to allow the media to lie to you by falsely claiming that he said that there are very fine white supremacists in Charlottesville? He didn't say that. It's a lie. He takes on the topic we've taken on so many times before, and ignore the so-called Black Lives Matter organization that openly, on their website, he says, called for the destruction of the nuclear family. My fellow Americans, our families need each other. We need black fathers in the homes with their wives and children. The future of our communities depend on it. I'm blessed to be able to run an inner-city youth program and also to teach in prisons across America. The inmates in my federal prison program literally receive days off of their sentence just for attending my class. And then finally, he wanted to give a little bit of a history lesson as well to some of the African Americans there listening, or just even some of the others listening. And he certainly spent some time talking about that.
He said Republicans are the party that freed the slaves and the party that put the first black men and women in Congress. It's the party of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and now Tim Scott and Donald Trump. Our president has made incredible strides to end mass incarcerations and give unprecedented opportunities for black in America. America, let this election be a call for all God's people who are called by his name to humble themselves and pray together and seek his face and turn from their wicked ways. And then he will hear us from heaven, and he will forgive our sins, and he will heal our land. Amen. And God bless. Pretty good speech. Not bad for a guy that we didn't necessarily even expect to be on the podium, and there he was. Of course, Mike Pence had a chance to speak as well, and next hour I'll get into some of the comments by Mike Pence. But one of the articles I've posted is by Katie Pavlich, who is actually saying that there may be a convention bump. In the past, there almost always has been a bump for each particular presidential candidate after the convention because a lot of people get a chance to see it. Doesn't seem like there was much of a bump for the Democratic nominees. That would be Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Looks like so far, and we're only into now the final fourth day, so the bump usually shows up a little bit later, but so far it looks like there has been a bump for Donald Trump and Mike Pence. The Zogby survey, which we used to use all the time, actually has a 52% approval rating for Donald Trump so far. And Paul Bedard even went on to say that buoyed by black and independent voters as well as urban dwellers, we are starting to see that President Trump's approval rating is going up, in large part because people are being turned off to the violence in the street. And so when you start looking at some of these states, and I will go through this more in the next hour since we will be broadcasting to the national hour, you can begin to see that. And one of the individuals that I tend to quote quite often is Nate Silver. Now, philosophically, politically, theologically, we disagree. But that doesn't matter because, if nothing else, he says the fundamentals are improving for Donald Trump. He says the economy is getting better, although that could be threatened by congressional inaction, and COVID cases are going down. And so, again, Nate Silver really points out that this is maybe one of the reasons why the approval rating is going up. Now, if you know anything about Nate Silver, you know that he's supposed to be, quote, on the other side. But I read his book. I've got his book on my shelf, Signal and Noise. And it kind of reminded me, if you ever watched the movie General Patton, remember in the beginning there where General Patton is actually winning there in North Africa as he's fighting Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He says, I read your book. You know, in other words, I read the book of my enemy. I don't consider Nate Silver an enemy, but I have read his book, and I do read his pieces, and that might be a difference between, say, the left and hopefully you, and that is read widely. Read people that you don't agree with and see what they have to say, because the other side says there's nothing you can add to this conversation. Nate Silver has obviously been somebody that's been very supportive of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, but also tend to believe that he is very good at looking at polls and at statistics. And as a matter of fact, his Signal and Noise is all about how you can kind of find some trends, and he has been a master of doing that. So read widely, read people maybe you won't agree with. You'll learn something. We'll be right back.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It's the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be covering quite a bit of things and topics over the next 2 hours, so I hope you'll stay with us for all of that. First off, let me just mention that Hurricane Laura has pounded the Gulf Coast, and perhaps one of the strongest hurricanes ever to strike the United States mainland. 150-mile-an-hour winds. Those of you overseas or knowing metric, it would be 240 kilometers per hour. Just unbelievable, the force of the winds. As recently as about an hour ago, I think the only fatality we knew of was a 14-year-old girl who died when a tree fell on her home. But we're talking about a storm surge of water that pushed almost 40 miles inland. One individual described it as like 1,000 tornadoes coming through the area, just devastating some areas. But tremendous destruction, not as much loss of life, but we'll continue to watch that, and just wanted to acknowledge that as a topic that we will get to later. And something else we'll get to later this hour is, of course, last night was night 3 of the Republican National Convention, featuring a number of very significant women associated with the Republican Party, and we'll come into some of that, as well as a few individuals that have been involved in the civil rights movement. Clarence Henderson, a veteran of the 1960 civil rights movement. And then a speech that many people thought might have been one of the best in the evening, and that is from the former NFL star Jack Brewer, who actually was able to speak to this issue and has been a leader of Black Voices for Trump, and gave some very good historical perspective, and really in some respects seemed to even be speaking to some of the African American viewers out there. So we'll talk about that. And of course, the evening ended with a famous speech by the Vice President Mike Pence, as he had a chance to speak there from Fort McHenry. And the production values continue to be very high and very good, and so we'll talk about some of that a little bit later. We have a number of articles that we have posted on a variety of topics that we will be addressing, and so that will be the case. Matter of fact, just as a program note, let me just mention that next hour, Larry Crabb will be with us. We'll be talking about his book, Waiting for Heaven. But one of the issues that so many people certainly talk to me about is what is happening in the media. As a matter of fact, this weekend I happen to be speaking at a conference, unfortunately by Zoom, in which we'll be talking about truth in the media, talking about social media and things like that. And I think the big challenge so often we face is when I turn on our television set or get on my computer, what good family-oriented entertainment is out there? What about the things that are going to encourage me and my family in our faith, and also be something that will be useful for us and entertaining for us? So that's one of the reasons why I encourage you to go to our website, because we have a link to Encourage TV. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But Bridgestone Multimedia Group has announced now a free faith and family family programming channel called Encourage TV. And we want to talk about what that means. But in order to do so, let's bring on an individual that can give us some great perspective on that. And that will be Steve Bulzoni. More than 25 years he's had experience in the film and television industry before joining with BMG. Before that, actually was a vice president for business development at Premier Digital. And even before that, I worked with Take 4 Digital, and as an individual that brings a wealth of experience to this area. So, Steve, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me, Kerby. Appreciate it.
Talk about this because people on our listening audience so often are saying to me when I go out and meet them, or even sometimes when they call in on the show, there's just not a lot of good things to watch. And now it seems to me that Bridgestone Multimedia Group has provided a free faith and family programming channel. And a lot of people would like to know, well, what is it and how do I connect up to it?
Well, I loved your introduction where you used the word encourage a couple of times, because the name of our channel is called Encourage TV. And it stems from the ideals of Bridgestone Multimedia Group. We've been a distributor of content in the CBA and now the CRA for about 30 or 35 years. And BMG has a video library of over 400 feature-length films that are proprietary to us that we distribute worldwide, and thousands of episodes of television content. So we just launched early this year in January, Encourage TV as a free on-demand app that you can watch on Roku and Fire TV through Amazon and Android and YouTube, and it's coming to a bunch of other platforms as well. So we're real excited about it. We've seen some really great early success, and again, we thank you for letting us talk about it.
Well, let's talk about the range of it. First of all, I would encourage people right now, just simply go to pointofview.net and then click on that button that says Encourage TV. First thing that pops up is, okay, what's your favorite app? You've talked about it, Fire TV, YouTube, Roku, whatever it might be. So you click on one of those. And then what pops up is pretty amazing, because you have a whole section on popular uploads, feature films, short features, kids films, TV series, documentaries, classic movies, as well as trailers for a number of others, and Christmas films. And so there's just a lot of resource. And for individuals that are sometimes lamenting that there's nothing good to watch on TV, you've provided them with a cornucopia of family-friendly material, right?
Right, and not only nothing good to watch on TV, sometimes too much good to pay for on TV, and so we're giving a free option for the cord cutters, and you talk about millennials a lot on your show, the cord cutters and the millennials who don't want to have the large monthly bills to consume their entertainment, and we're all free. So we're excited to offer that in an encouraging and otherwise for the viewers.
Let's see if we can maybe feature a couple. Since the other day we had Eric Metaxas on, I'll pick that one because you have a documentary on Bonhoeffer, also one on Bunker Hill, and a variety of others. So those are very good educational. And since I'm going to be focusing most of our time after the break on entertainment, there are some great educational features there as well on Encourage TV, aren't there?
Yeah, we have some great series that are educational in nature that are listed in the television content sections of our apps, and all of our content. We like to think that all of our content is inspirational, has some sort of entertainment and educational and encouraging attributes for our viewers, and that's one of the things that we do when we curate content for our network.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about a couple of the resources, and then I'll let you go. But I wanted to educate our listeners for just a few minutes, if we could, about some of these issues, because if nothing else, this, we thought, would be something that you would want to know more about. It's called Encourage TV, and we have a link to it on our website. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more, you can simply go to pointofview.net, and that will give you the link that you need. And all you have to do at that point is figure out what might be your particular app that you would be most likely to use it on. And then you can watch it on your computer. You can hook it up to your TV and watch it there. And there are just all sorts of great resources about that. So we'll talk about a couple of the other resources that are available at Encourage TV. And I hope you'll take advantage of it because I love the price. Free. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Why do rioters in the streets have so much rage? Trying to find rational answers to irrational actions is often a worthless endeavor. But Ned Ryan has found some reasons for the misdirected rage of young rioters. His recent column parallels some of the insights from the book The Coddling of the American Mind that I've discussed in previous commentaries. He notes that many of the rioters come from a spoiled, enabled, and poorly educated generation or two. He says we shouldn't be surprised when we see them looting, rioting, and tearing down statues. Some of this, he believes, goes back to the self-esteem movement of the 1990s when children were told that they were best, even when they weren't. They grew up where everyone got participation trophies. Add to the fact that they spent years at indoctrination centers of higher learning where they were spoon-fed all the lies about how evil our country is, that it is a place rotten to the core, and that it should be burned to the ground. But then they graduate from schools with worthless degrees and staggering debt. They can't find jobs, so they rage against the system. They blame the free market capitalist system. Ned Ryan understands their anger, but believes it is misplaced. They rage against a version of capitalism implemented by corporations. He says that what we have today is crony capitalist system filled with vulture capitalists who manipulate markets and politics to their advantage. They want to burn capitalism and the American society down, but they need to focus their targets and pay closer attention. Their rage, unfortunately, stems from the miseducation they received in school, coupled with the real concerns about crony capitalism that is misdirected at the free market. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continuing our conversation with Steve Bulzoni for just a few more minutes. He's the Vice President of Business Development and Strategic Partnerships with a Bridgestone Multimedia Group, which has launched this new Encourage TV, which is a free faith and family programming channel that is very easy for you to connect up to. And Steve, one of the things we like to do is promote from time to time really good family-friendly types of films. I know one called Lost Heart is coming out, and maybe in the future we're going to be doing an interview with one or two of the people that acted in that. And I believe, if I'm right, that is in something that will be available through Encourage TV as well.
It will, and we have a special premiere that we're going to be launching on Encourage TV in October, and we, with all the challenges that films are finding in the theaters, and with premieres these days, we're going to do kind of a special premiere where we're going to have a premiere party, and we're going to stream the premiere party and then show the film as a premiere, and then show an after party on Encourage TV as well. So we're trying to do some things that are a little outside of the box in response to what's going on in the market and the challenges of people, that people have going to the theaters and watching shows. So we're trying to do some exciting things, and Lost Heart is going to be our first endeavor into that.
Well, again, I think more and more of that's going to take place. I feel sorry for the theaters, definitely, because a lot of people are saying, I don't need to go to the theater. I can watch it on my home, and especially with so much of it being free. A minute ago, I mentioned the documentaries. Let me just skip up for a second before we get into some of the entertainment. Even under your category on TV series, you have the American Heritage Collection. Let me just alert to our listeners out there that are homeschooling, and quite frankly now, not only do we have a lot of people homeschooling, but you're in some cases having your kids in the public schools still online, and so if you wanted to teach some of the history and those kinds of things, discovering America's founders and all the rest, that is the case. Or even some of us that are really old, and I'm the oldest one around the table here, remember the Roy Rogers series that's part of that as well. So they're just all sorts of incredible resources that I actually am very pleased with. But let's get back to that. I've been featuring most of the things that are documentaries or things that would be good for teaching, but you just got a lot of great family-friendly type of movies that are part of the resources there at Courage TV. Talk about a couple that people need to know about.
Yeah, well, I think the family-friendly moniker is something that we strongly believe in and use as our kind of our log line. Everything that we do is family friendly. We get everything approved by the Dove. As a matter of fact, Encourage TV is one of the only channels on Roku that is fully Dove approved. So we've got that seal of approval, and we have all genres available for entertainment. And like you said, Kerby Entertainment. All of them are family friendly. They might not appeal to the whole family, but they're the kind of thing where if a parent is watching with an 8-year-old kid, the 8-year-old might not be completely interested, but there's nothing that would be offensive, and there's always a lesson to be learned. So that's how we kind of curate our content. And one that I wanted to talk about, you actually had a really talented young star of one of our films on your show a couple of months ago. Her name is Natasha Beret, and she's in the film called Home Sweet Home. Right. And Home Sweet Home is one of our newer films, and we're real excited about that. And that's just the kind of film that has a great message, and it's really a crossover message too, Kerby. It's a message of somebody who gets to a point where they're tired of living a superficial life, and they realize that there's more to life than satisfying their own personal needs, and they reach out and begin to live a life of helping people. And so that's the kind of content it's funny, it's a romantic comedy, it's engaging, it has a great lesson, it's very well done, and has really great cast that does a really great job. And those are the kinds of things we're trying to bring to the public through Encourage TV.
Very humorous, if nothing else, because she's fixated on this young man who is obviously very good with a hammer, and she is obviously not very good with a hammer. Natasha Beret, Home Sweet Home, and so it's kind of fun, it's romantic. Lots of times people say, well, some of these have kind of a Hallmark feel to them, although this one I think even is better than some of the other ones that we've talked about. So again, they're just some great resources. So one last time before I let you go, because we're going to get back into all the issues in the news, how can people connect up to this? Because you have some great opportunities for people to have access to faith and family programming, and it's free, but what do they need to know, and what do they need to do next?
The easiest, simple thing is to go to encouragetv.com, and it will give you options to connect, subscribe, and to view all of our content, and it's all free. Subscribing's free and viewing's free. So that's the way to do it.
Well, Steve Bulzoni, thank you very much for putting this together, and thank you for joining us today on Point of View. I wanted our listeners to know they have some options, and I do feel sorry for some of the people in the theater business, because more and more people are going to say, I can see just great films at home, on my computer, on my TV, and I can enjoy them and not even have to worry about getting the pandemic or the coronavirus. So thank you so very much for what you've done to make this possible.
Thanks, Kerby. Appreciate you having me.
We're going to take a break, but just before we do so, let me just give you a little bit of an overview of what's going to take place. First of all, we've posted a couple of articles, and one of those, of course, has to do with this issue of what you might be able to benefit from in terms of Encourage TV. We're going to look at the Republican National Convention, and, of course, we are a little bit premature, but nevertheless, one of the articles I've posted is whether or not there's going to be a convention bump. Now, historically, after a Republican convention or a Democratic convention, usually there's a bump for the presidential candidate. And doesn't seem like there's been much for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Looks like there's been some so far. And, of course, we're only into the third day of the fourth day. Sometimes it takes a day or two before you can really discern whether or not there's a bump. But one of the articles I've posted is by Katie Pavlich. The Trump convention bump is already here. And her argument is that we can look at a couple of things, and one of those is the Zogby studies and polls that have been done. And according at least to the survey by Zogby, President Donald Trump is now sitting at a 52% approval rating. Paul Bedard puts it this way: buoyed by blacks and independent voters, as well as urban dwellers shocked by the Black Lives Matter protest violence taking place in some of the cities, President Trump's approval rating has hit a new high, according to a survey which is heavy with minority voters. The latest Zogby Analytics poll actually has Trump's approval at 52%, which is the highest so far. And again, you tend to expect that sometimes after a convention, but that's already happening in the midst of this convention, because this came out, of course, just a few days ago, and already we are starting to see that. The poll came out yesterday, but of course the poll's done before that, so in some respects, who knows where it goes by the end of the week. For those of you that are in some of those swing states, now, Arizona, Biden 49, Trump 47. Florida, Biden 49, Trump 46. Michigan, Biden 50, Trump 44. Still very significant difference there. North Carolina, Biden 48%, Trump 47%. Pennsylvania, Biden 49%, Trump 46%. Wisconsin, Biden 49%, Trump 44%. Again, a little bit of a gap. But it has been interesting to see how that movement has taken place. And some of those are at least within the margin of error. And one of the people that looks at these polls with, I think, a great deal of discernment is a man by the name of Nate Silver. Nate Silver is an individual that accurately predicted the election of Barack Obama, is really very good at reading polls and statistics. I have his book Signal and Noise on my desk and on my bookshelf, and an individual that has said one of the reasons why Donald Trump seems to be improving, 2 points. Number one, the economy is getting better, although he says it could be threatened by congressional interaction. Number two, COVID cases are going down, although that could reverse itself. But nevertheless, Nate Silver, who maybe we wouldn't necessarily agree with, but I certainly value his research. And like I said, I have his book and tend to read him quite often. And I used an example a while back, but I think I'll use it again. If you've ever watched the movie George Patton, and there's a point where George Patton is actually winning the battle against Field Marshal Erwin Rommel on North Africa. And at one point on the movie, he says, "I read your book." Now, there's question as to whether or not he did, although some people think he did. It's doubtful he said that out loud, but it's a good example. Sometimes you need to read the books or the articles of people that you don't necessarily agree with. And if there's one thing I've been encouraging you to do, Nate Silver, he's probably not going to agree with most of the things we talk about here on Point of View, but he does a very good job of doing an analysis of trends and even of presidential campaigns. And so if nothing else, I think it is kind of intriguing to see that. And that's one of the articles we've posted for you to read today in case you'd like to read a little bit more. But we need to take a break. And when we come back, I'll get into what happened last night in the Republican National Convention. Then we'll move into a couple of the other issues as well in terms of the rioting that is still taking place in Portland and in a number of other locales and what that might mean for the presidential campaign as well. So let's take a break. We'll have more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you've been watching, seen 4 nights of the Democratic National Convention, 3 nights of the Republican Convention. I suspect a good number of you have not been watching, and that is illustrated by the fact that those particular numbers are really down, and no surprise about that, because after all, it's a virtual convention, and there are also maybe a lot of people that are just sort of apathetic after all the things they've been through with the pandemic and the lockdowns and the protest and the riots and everything else. I understand that, although I will give credit to the people that have put together the Republican Convention. I think, if nothing else, they may have already planned this, or else they learned by watching the Democratic Convention to say giving speeches in an empty room or a nearly empty room is not working so well. And so last night, of course, we saw the Vice President Mike Pence, as we saw the night before, the First Lady, to actually address an audience, and the audience there was at Fort McHenry. Very significant, because that was the fort that was under siege in the War of 1812, and was also the place for the inspiration of our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. So Vice President Pence spoke last night, had a bit of a crowd there, and of course you also will know that tonight, as he will be speaking to an audience on the South Lawn, President Trump will be there, and I know Kelly Shackelford will be one of the people sitting there. And then will join us tomorrow in our Friday weekend edition. We'll have Dr. Merle Matthews and Kelly Shackelford with us as well. Anyway, the Vice President spoke last night, talked about some of the successes in terms of foreign policy. That would be the U.S. Embassy being moved to Jerusalem, the killing of the ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Also talked a little bit about the coronavirus, and this is a nation of miracles. But a lot of what people have been either commenting on or criticizing him on are the comments he made about, of course, the opposition, and that would be Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. He said last week Joe Biden didn't say a word about the violence and chaos engulfing cities across this country. Matter of fact, a very good piece that I will get to a little bit later, the crisis that Democrats dare not mention. Now they're starting to talk about it, but they weren't then. He said, let me be clear, the violence must stop, whether in Minneapolis, Portland, or Kenosha. Too many heroes have died defending our freedoms to see Americans strike each other down. He then says, President Trump and I know the men and women that put on the uniform of law enforcement are the best of us. They put their lives on the line every single day. And then he recognized David Patrick Underwood, who was one of the officers who was killed at the George Floyd riots. And his sister, interesting enough, Angela, was in the audience there, and they cut to her a little bit later. And he said, Angela, we grieve for your family, and we're grateful for his service, and America will never forget Dave Patrick Underwood and his service and sacrifice to the nation. The most criticized comment by the vice president last night was this. He says, the hard truth is, you won't be safe in Joe Biden's America. Under President Trump, we will stand with those who stand on the thin blue line, and we're not going to defund the police, not now, not ever. And it was those kinds of comments that certainly generated the greatest amount of applause from the audience, but also some of the comments that came later on that regard. A couple more points real quickly. He said at the root of the agenda for the Biden-Harris ticket is the belief that America is driven by envy, not aspiration, that millions of Americans harbor ill will towards their neighbors instead of loving our neighbors as themselves. The radical left believes the federal government must be involved in every aspect of our lives to correct those American wrongs. They believe the federal government needs to dictate how Americans live, how we should work, how we should raise our children, and in the process deprive our people of freedom, prosperity, and security. And then one of the things that we were certainly wondering if would be used, because after all, sometimes a statement made by one candidate is then picked up by another. And so using a statement that was made by Joe Biden, the vice president then said, our economic recovery is on the ballot, law and order is on the ballot, but so are things far more fundamental and foundational to our country. It's not so much whether America will be more conservative or more liberal, more Republican or more Democrat. The choice in this election is whether America remains means America. So just a couple of summaries from some of the things said by the vice president. Last night, it seemed that one of the other themes they want to address was the issue of women, and that's why you had so many different women speaking. Governor Kristi Noem from the governor of South Dakota talked about heroes and opposing the mob. Senator Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee gave a warning about the radical left. Representative Elise Stefanik from New York extolled the American dream. Of course, you then had the White House press secretary Kayleigh McEnany talking about her double mastectomy. You had Second Lady Karen Pence talking about the 19th Amendment. And then you had Kellyanne Conway talking about the number of people that President Trump has elevated, a number of women that have been elevated, I should say, to senior positions. First in business and then in government, and so went into that in some detail. Laura Trump was up there. She was also speaking. She is the wife of Eric Trump, and spent some time talking about that under President Trump's leadership, women's unemployment hit the lowest level since World War II. 4.3 million new jobs created for women in 2009, and women took over 70% of those new jobs. But I think it would also be worthwhile mentioning that there was a real emphasis, maybe returning back to the theme on Monday, on civil rights. And two individuals I thought I'd highlight before we take the break. Clarence Henderson, who was a veteran, he said, of the 1960s civil rights movement, and then a former NFL star, Jack Brewer, who is actually the leader of what is called Black Voices for Trump. Clarence Henderson, being a civil rights leader, said that 60 years ago, segregation was legal and enforced. A simple act of sitting at a lunch counter could lead to physical harm, jail time, or worse. He says, I know that from personal experience. By sitting down to order a cup of coffee, we challenged injustice. We knew it was necessary, but we didn't know what would happen. He talks about facing down the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. He talks about being cursed and called all sorts of names. But then identified himself as a graduate of HBCU, which stands for the Historically Black Colleges and Universities, also a military veteran and a civil rights activist, and then said that he supports Donald Trump. And then took on this kind of history lesson. He said, if that sounds strange to you, learn your history. It was the Republican Party that passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. It was the Republican Party that passed the 14th Amendment giving black men citizenship. And it was the Republican Party that passed the 15th Amendment giving black men the right to vote. And so he went through some of the things that Donald Trump has done and then kind of concluded by simply saying these achievements demonstrate that Donald Trump truly cares about black lives. His policies show his heart. He has done more for black Americans, he said, in 4 years than Joe Biden has done in 50. And this is America I was fighting for 60 years ago. This is the America Donald Trump is fighting for today. Which leads to the other individual, who is Jack Brewer, who took the time to, first of all, because he's a little younger, say, I wasn't necessarily involved in all the civil rights movement, but my dad was. And he said, I remember my dad's bravery when he stood against the KKK rally in my town. My father taught me to back down for no one. He says, I know what racism looks like. I've seen it firsthand, and it has no resemblance to President Trump, and I'm fed up with the way he's portrayed in the media, who refuse to acknowledge what he's actually done for the black community. And then he sort of sent some messages to any African Americans that might be watching that particular speech that he gave, because he asked, are we so offended by the president's campaign slogan, Make America Great Again, that we're going to ignore that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have collectively been responsible for locking up countless black men for nonviolent crimes? Are we going to allow the media to lie to you about falsely claiming that he said there were very fine white supremacists in Charlottesville? He didn't say that. It's a lie. And ignore the so-called Black Lives Matter organization that openly on their website called for the destruction of the nuclear family. So he said, my fellow Americans, our families need each other. We need black fathers in the homes with their wives and children. The future of our communities depend on it. He says, I'm blessed to run an inner city youth program and also to teach in prisons across America. And so he talks about some of those very important issues. But he ends by simply saying that if nothing else, let this election be a call for all God's people who are called by his name to humble themselves and pray together and to seek his face and to turn from our wicked ways, and then he will hear from heaven and will forgive our sins, and he will heal our land. Amen, and God bless. So it was a very powerful speech. Many people think it may have been the best speech of the night, and I knew very little about him, did not expect that this would have such an impact, but it is one that a lot of people have been talking about today, and you can certainly find it out there on the websites if you would like to watch it in its entirety. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, for just a few more minutes, and let me just mention at the top of the hour, then we'll have Dr. Larry Crabb with us, as we'll be talking about his book, Waiting for Heaven, Freedom from the Incurable Addiction to Self. Good break from some of the issues in the news. And tomorrow, we will have, of course, our weekend edition. And one of the things I think we will focus on are the remarkable differences between the Republican convention and the Democratic convention, not just in terms of policy, which we've certainly talked about so often and will continue to talk about, but how one particular convention talked about certain issues and the other convention never mentioned it. A good example, and we'll probably post this article tomorrow by Alexandra DeSanctis, why Republicans talk about abortion and Democrats don't. And, of course, a very powerful speech just the other day by Abby Johnson, a former clinic director for Planned Parenthood, going into incredible detail about what abortion is. And I was struck by some some of the tweets that came out afterwards, some people saying, I had no idea. And I thought, really? I mean, we've been talking about abortion for decades, and people go, I had no idea. And another one, which is by Rich Lowry, maybe we'll post it tomorrow, and maybe I'll just read part of it right now, the crisis that Democrats dare not mention, because he talks about the fact that during the Democratic National Convention, they mentioned almost every sort of malady except one. Is the country going through a terrible pandemic? Yes. Is it punishing recession? Absolutely. Is our democratic system itself under threat? Of course. Is the planet about to be destroyed by inaction on climate change? Check. Are systematic racism, inequality, corporate greed blighting our nation? Most definitely. One got left off, and that was, of course, after 4 nights and 8 hours of programming, nobody mentioned, not the community activists, not the mayors, not the governors, not the former presidents, the first ladies, anybody on what? The conflict in the streets, which has gotten more intense. It was kind of interesting because one of the criticisms of the vice president is, well, he really hasn't been mentioning what's going on in Kenosha. Well, I think he sort of implied it, and of course everybody else has been talking about it, and front and center they have been talking about it. And of course they also mentioned the hurricane and a number of other things. But part of the problem, I think, of people jumping to conclusions is we don't have all the facts. And now it has been revealed by the Wisconsin Justice Department that Jacob Blake, who was shot in the back, had a knife in his possession and actually was on the driver's side floorboard. So that doesn't necessarily justify the actions that were taken, but it gives us an illustration that there was a lot more going on. We now have seen other videos, and if you go back to the Kenosha police scanner audio, it confirms that Blake was named as an individual who's not supposed to be at the property, had taken the complainant's keys and was refusing to give them back. Also, there was an alert on this for a 99 for this subject, which is, of course, an outstanding arrest warrant. So those are all sorts of facts that didn't seem to factor into the decision by the Milwaukee Bucks to decide to unilaterally decide they weren't going to play the playoff game. And all of a sudden, we didn't have NBA games. We didn't have WNBA games. We didn't have Major League Baseball games. We didn't have Major League Soccer games. All because I think some of the facts, which sometimes you have to wait to get, just were sort of ignored. And James Carafano puts it this way: we have 5 reasons why some of these violent radicals are becoming more emboldened. Number 5, he says, we're facing a capable enemy. Some of the street militias have shifted their targets and tactics and are bringing more to the fight. Number 4, there's a war in our streets. Sustained violent protests attract extremists who actually want more extreme violence. And as we've seen in Portland, violent extremists then draw counter-extremists, and all of a sudden now you have even more fights in the street. Number 3, local officials have failed us, and he talks about the fact that Portland, Seattle, Chicago, all sorts of cities have spiraled out of control because some of the political leadership have failed to even address the issue. And when you go through a national convention and never even talk about it, maybe that emboldens individuals. Number 2, our media has failed us because, again, while there have been some things that have been given wall-to-wall coverage, certainly the violence in the cities has not been one of them. And the number 1, he says, the politicians have failed us. And so as a result, we have seen what has taken place. And I've got in front of me here something that's, of course, disturbing. A church was burned down in Wisconsin. So you now have in Kenosha, Wisconsin, not only the destruction of so many businesses, and we're talking about a mattress store, of course, the church, Mexican restaurant, cell phone store, all the broken windows at the car dealerships and other things. As one person put out on the tweet, nothing like burning a church to reflect anger. So this is a piece that was forwarded to me by Kelly Shackelford. I think he's going to have a lot more to say about the burning down and attacking of churches. And he probably will also want to say something about the other article I've posted. This is by Todd Starnes, and that is a message was put on the front door of a church in Santa Clara, California, North Valley Baptist Church. It was a cease and desist order that came from Santa Clara. The congregation, according to Todd Starnes, has been accused of holding indoor services, failing to ensure that speakers wore face masks, and singing. And Todd Starnes says, good readers, the church stands accused of singing hymns and spiritual songs. And the letter reads, North Valley Baptist is failing to prevent those attending, performing, and speaking at North Valley Baptist services from singing. This activity is unlawful, which I don't know I would have expected. Todd Starnes puts it this way. Let that sink in for just a minute, folks. Congregational worship is against the law in California. And then it goes on to read a little bit more from the letter. The letter says, this county understands that singing is an intimate and meaningful component of religious worship. However, public health experts have also determined that singing together in close proximity without face coverings transmit virus particles further in the air than breathing or speaking quietly. And, of course, Todd Starnes doesn't let some of that go because he points out that, indeed, as the letter says, the county demands that North Valley Baptist immediately cease the activities listed above and fully comply with the risk reduction order, the gatherings directive, and the state July 13th order and state guidance. Failure to do so will result in enforcement action by the county. And Todd Starnes can't resist by saying, it is important to remember that North Valley Baptist Church is in the United States, not the Soviet Union. Are there possible risks of gathering together? Yes, there are. Can intelligent people modify those risks and deal with those? I think they can. Can churches do so? I think they can as well. But this battle will continue to go on, and it is one that will keep at least some attention to as we begin to focus on that. But I did want you to at least have access to some of these articles we've posted, one dealing with the convention bump, one dealing with the cease and desist order that was posted on the church's front door. I have information about the book we're going to be talking about in just a minute, Waiting for Heaven. And a while back, a couple hours ago, I actually did an interview on one of the articles we posted on the biblical roots of capitalism, how prosperity and generosity really file back to the biblical views of capitalism, and I thought you might find that particular article helpful as well. Well, we're talking about that. My Viewpoints commentary today is entitled The Misdirected Rage, and a lot of that comes from Ned Ryan, who points out that there are some reasons why young people may be in the streets angry about what is happening in the culture, but a lot of their rage is misdirected, especially when you're tearing down businesses and churches and others that have maybe been doing so much good. And even acknowledges that maybe they don't like capitalism, but what they're really reacting against is a crony capitalist system, not a real free market. But anyway, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to have a chance to break from all the news and talk with our friend Larry Crabb. All that coming up right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yeah, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that we talk about a lot of different topics. Sometimes we talk about addiction, as we did just the other day. Sometimes we talk about self-addiction or narcissism, and that is a topic that surfaces. We sometimes get into theological issues like heaven and the eternal state, and we oftentimes talk about counseling and how to maybe bring about a real and significant change in a person's personality and behavior. And in some respects, this hour, we're going to pull all of those pieces together in this book that came out just about a month ago, Waiting for Heaven, Freedom from the Incurable Addiction to Self. And it is written by Dr. Larry Crabb, individual that I suspect all of us know, author of more than 25 books, Inside Out, probably one of his better known, founder of New Way Ministries, and founder of Larger Story. He, of course, has a Ph.D. in clinical psychology. Also has served as the Distinguished Scholar in Residence at Colorado Christian University. And Dr. Larry Crabb, a delight to have you on the program with us today.
Great to be with you, Kerby. It's my privilege.
Give us a little bit of a sense of the genesis of this. Your son does a little of that in the introduction. But in a sense, I get the sense that you not only come to this conclusion about how looking and waiting for heaven is important for the people that you counsel, it's really important for all of us, and it really comes from your observation of society. But tell us more, if you might.
And it also comes from my look in a mirror. I'm 76 years old. I've gone through leukemia. I currently have a struggle with cancer that is not life-threatening. And I just find myself saying that I'm getting maybe a little bit weary. I don't want to use the word cynical, but kind of weary about the fact that, in my observation at least, that a whole lot of emphasis in the church, from the pulpit and Christian books, is legitimately on here's the principles for how to live now. And the implication, I think, that we easily take from that is if we follow these principles, life's going to really go well for us. It's going to be just right. You know, if you're a really good husband, you're going to have a great marriage. If you're a really good mom and dad, you're going to have great kids. If you eat healthy, you're going to stay well. You're not going to get sick. And that just isn't true. And it just seems to me that one of the things that I think is really not picked up on, that I maybe first picked up from C.S. Lewis. He's kind of my favorite writer, I suppose. I think you need to read C.S. Lewis to be clear on a lot of things. At least that's my prejudice. But he talks about, in Mere Christianity, he talks about the inconsolable longing in every human heart. We have a desire that nothing in this world can fill. And that just makes eminent sense to me. And he goes on to say that this desire is something that nothing in this world can satisfy. Therefore, we need to consider that maybe we were made for another world. And I don't hear, at least in my exposure, I'm sure there's exceptions to this, but I just don't hear a real focus on waiting for heaven and saying, you know, if you eliminate heaven, if you don't believe in heaven, I don't really see much of a point to Christianity. But if you do believe in heaven, then I see nothing but Christianity as the point. And that's kind of been my way of thinking, that I haven't heard much talking about heaven. And looking back on, I've done a fair amount of preaching, and I'm not sure when I've been preaching much about heaven. And I thought, well, the Bible talks about it a lot. Peter even says in 1 Peter, you know, fix your entire hope on life going well? No. Fix your entire hope on getting over your cancer? No. Fix your entire hope on what's going to be revealed when Jesus comes back. And so it just seems to me that this needs to be a real focus. And as I began to think about that, I thought too about the whole addiction issue. And I'll just make a quick comment about that we can go any direction you like. But it just seems to me that when we hear the word addiction, we immediately and understandably think about, drugs or alcohol or sex and maybe even money. But I really believe that the core addiction we have is what Luther said: we're all addicted to ourselves. That there's just a fundamental narcissism, which you mentioned, I think, quite accurately. When I was in graduate school, I learned about narcissism, but I learned it was a psychological disorder that afflicts only a few. And I'm thinking, no, I don't think so. I think narcissism is a preoccupation with yourself and looking at life as the opportunity to get what I want and to kind of demand it. And so I'm thinking about a relational addiction is maybe the root of all the other kind of addictive disorders. So that's just a scattered response to your great question.
Well, again, it's a great connection to C.S. Lewis, because sometimes I use that quote: if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. And that is always a good use of quote from C.S. Lewis when we're talking, and when I'm talking with atheists, because you can meet the physical needs. We've got a dog at home right now. In the past, we had cats, but, I don't know what dog contentment or cat contentment looks like, but they look pretty content. You can meet the physical needs of human beings, and they wander this planet looking for more. And of course, what they're looking for is heaven. And let me just mention, the book is entitled Waiting for Heaven. It's out now, and you probably could find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so that you can find it in case you can't find it and would like to read it. It is available, of course, now because it's come out in July, both in paperback and Kindle. 15 chapters. Part 1, useful waiting. Part 2, difficult waiting. Part 3, powerful waiting. And the first part that you make is this idea of self-addiction. But I didn't get far into this book. Dr. Larry Crabb, before I go, was Paul addicted to himself? That's the second chapter. And you take us into the book of Romans to address that issue, don't you?
Well, I do take the position that is not universally agreed upon, but a whole lot of Bible scholars that are far more scholarly than I am. By the way, you introduced me as a distinguished scholar in residence at Colorado Christian University. I'm not distinguished. I'm not really a scholar. I'm not even in residence in Colorado anymore. So that's
well, you were for 24 years anyway.
I was for 24 years, so I guess it's okay.
Yeah.
But your question again, I got myself sidetracked.
Oh, that's okay. Maybe we'll take a break and we'll come back and get into whether or not Paul was addicted to himself, because if the Apostle Paul was addicted to himself, then I think we can all say that we were as well. That really takes us into, of course, Romans 7, so we'll get into that in just a minute.
Absolutely.
And also this idea of self-addiction, because if indeed we understand that, then in some respects it connects up to all the other addictions we're talking about. So if you find yourself saying you want to get this book, we do have information about it on the website. You can be looking for it in your local bookstore, but I think this one would be probably easier for you to be able to purchase. It is available both in paperback and Kindle. And at the same time, we also, of course, have some other information about Larry Crabb in case you would like to know more about him or many of his other books. So let's take one of those breaks, and then when we come back, we're going to get into this in more particular detail, because if self-addiction is true, I think that it is, it leads to all sorts of other particular addictions or even sins that cause and affect not only the non-Christian world, but the Christian world. And he talks about the fact that our self-protection then keeps from hurting our self-procurement, angling to enhance our self-esteem through others, and our self-preservation techniques, which manifest themselves in relational sin. So we'll talk about what that means, and we'll get into the idea of casual Christianity and counterfeit Christianity and much more. So we have a lot to cover with Dr. Larry Crabb, and we will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Why do rioters in the streets have so much rage? Trying to find rational answers to irrational actions is often a worthless endeavor. But Ned Ryan has found some reasons for the misdirected rage of young rioters. His recent column parallels some of the insights from the book The Coddling of the American Mind that I've discussed in previous commentaries. He notes that many of the rioters come from a spoiled, enabled, and poorly educated generation or two. He says we shouldn't be surprised when we see them looting, rioting, and tearing down statues. Some of this, he believes, goes back to the self-esteem movement of the 1990s when children were told that they were best, even when they weren't. They grew up where everyone got participation trophies. Add to the fact that they spent years at indoctrination centers of higher learning where they were spoon-fed all the lies about how evil our country is, that it is a place rotten to the core, and that it should be burned to the ground. But then they graduate from schools with worthless degrees and staggering debt. They can't find jobs, so they rage against the system. They blame the free market capitalist system. Ned Ryan understands their anger, but believes it is misplaced. They rage against a version of capitalism implemented by corporations. He says that what we have today is crony capitalist system filled with vulture capitalists who manipulate markets and politics to their advantage. They want to burn capitalism and the American society down, but they need to focus their targets and pay closer attention. Their rage, unfortunately, stems from the miseducation they received in school, coupled with the real concerns about crony capitalism that is misdirected at the free market. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Larry Crabb as we talk about his new book, Waiting for Heaven, Freedom from the Incurable Addiction to Self. And Dr. Crabb, let's see if we can get into this, because in some respects the book is a great antidote to this idea that if you just do these things and follow these biblical principles, everything will be great. Well, not necessarily. And if nothing else, you really identify this issue of self-addiction and then say, really, if you look at it in the book of Romans, especially Romans chapter 7, the Apostle Paul seems to be struggling with this same issue of self-addiction that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I say in the book is that that our battle against sin becomes more intense, not less intense, as we mature. And I think that's what Paul indicates. Romans chapter 7, I take it to be Paul is talking about himself as already converted, already a Christian, and maybe even a mature Christian. And listen to the incredible things that this godly man, we call him the greatest Christian of all times, but what is he saying as he looks at his life? I don't really understand myself. I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. And I find a kind of a crazy comfort in that, because that's true of me too. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's part of the battle of walking on this narrow road that Jesus said not many people find, that maybe Paul was in fact born, and even after conversion, still had a struggle with his own being, had this old nature, some people call it, but a predisposition that is still there, maybe not central to his redeemed heart, but still there, called the flesh, that says, I want to understand what is good for me, and I'm going to pursue what is good for me. And if something that is wrong feels good to me, I might just go ahead and do it. And that's simply what I call an addiction to self. And do I think Paul was addicted to himself? Yeah, but I think he found some real victory. I don't think he found complete victory until he got to heaven, but he found some growth. He found some maturing. And that's what my book is arguing for. It's not arguing for sinless perfection, because if that's the case, I'm really missing out on that. But if it's true that we're not going to be fully glorified until, in fact, we are glorified by going to heaven, then that means that all of us need to reckon with the fact that there's a battle going on within us, and that was true of Billy Graham, true of Martin Luther, true of the Apostle Paul, and obviously true of the likes of me.
Well, and again, this is what we sometimes in a seminary call, sanctification as part of the growth that needs to take place in our lives. So that is certainly the case. But one of the things you do early on is talk about different kinds of Christians, committed Christians, casual Christians, and complacent Christians. And I love the chapter because it says one Christian who waits and two who don't. Talk about that for just a minute.
Yeah. The idea of committed Christians, and I think it's a rather small minority, and I think I've met a few, and I aspire to being in this category, but a person who's committed is so committed to the Lord's will in this difficult life because they know that God places a huge premium on patience and endurance. Colossians 1:11, Paul says, I want you to know the almighty power of God. And I wish he'd have finished that sentence by saying the almighty power of God, which delivers us now from any temptation to sin. But that's not what he says. And from any difficulties in life. But what he does say is, I want you to know the almighty power of God that enables us to endure and to be patient with our own failures, with life's difficulties. And a committed Christian takes that very, very seriously and is able to say that I'm going to wait for the full satisfaction that my soul longs for until I get to heaven, and I'm going to keep an awareness that the battle now is going to be real, but I'm committed to God's will even when it's difficult, and I'm going to call perseverance one of the core fundamental virtues of living the Christian life. That's a committed Christian, committed to God's will at any cost. We talk about spiritual formation, becoming like Jesus. Do we really want to become like Jesus? I mean, he lived in such a way that people hated him, and he gets himself killed. And I'm thinking I'd sort of like to not have that happen. So am I really committed to becoming like Jesus at any cost? And then you have what I call casual Christians who I think this is maybe the majority. And another phrase I have for that is people that are perhaps prematurely content in some way, that we're casual about our faith. We believe it. We hate our sin. But we really don't take it all that seriously, and we're just a little bit casual about it. We get discouraged, we hurt, we pray, we think we're repenting, but we really haven't gotten serious about what is the core battle going on inside of us that is going to require God's grace to have any victory at all. And then do we really find a thirst within our souls that, Psalm 42, I thirst for the living God. I can't wait for the day until I stand before him. A casual Christian would have that thought in his mind, but it wouldn't define his or her life because they take things a little too casually and not seriously enough. And then you have the complacent Christian, and this to me is, I think, too large of a group that I'm tempted to belong to. I've had a pretty good life, and I've been married 54 years, and my wife still loves me, and I love her, and we have 2 sons, and they both know the Lord, and I have enough money to go out for dinner. I've got good doctors that are taking care of my struggles. So, my life is good. Everything's just fine. And I'm just going to enjoy the blessings of God. And whenever something good happens, I'm just going to say, isn't God good? Because my life right now is blessed. And I think there's a lot of people, and there's sometimes I lean in this direction of looking at all the blessings of life and saying the blessings of life are God's promise that he's going to give us whatever we need to feel comfortable in this world. And that, to me, is a complacent Christian. So those are 3 categories that I aspire to belong to category number 1.
Well, and when you talk about the Apostle Paul, I mean, here you get the sense that he's ready to go to heaven. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Talks about these insignificant trials and troubles. And I thought, he has been shipwrecked, he's been stoned, he's been left for dead. And he refers to those as basically insignificant or small troubles, depending on which translation you have. And so in some respects, it is an illustration of what it's like to be a committed Christian who recognizes that just because I follow the Lord, everything isn't going to necessarily line up for me in a positive way. And Christians, unfortunately, in North America can sometimes believe that. But as you have probably traveled overseas, as I have as well, and I meet believers in other countries that are literally praying for their daily bread. They don't know where their next meal is coming from, and they're praying that they will be strong in the midst of persecution, not praying that they won't face persecution. That gives me a little bit better idea of what it means to be a committed Christian. What do you think?
It's a very different understanding of what it means to be a committed Christian. It really is very, very simple. It seems to me, for American people who generally live in some level of wealth in comparison with the people that you're speaking of, it's very well to become complacent about that and to assume that that is what Christianity is really all about, and that's what makes God good. I remember years ago when I was just a young guy, I was at a little church, and a fellow came up to me who was older, my senior by some years, and he just said to me before the church service began, he said, "Larry, I just want to share with you, my son just got a great raise in his job. He's making a lot of money now. Isn't God good?" And I remember my thought was, if your son had just been fired, would you say God is still good? And that got me thinking about, do we have a different definition of God's goodness than we're supposed to have? That maybe God's goodness has much more to do with dealing with our real problem, our deepest problem, sin, that deserves punishment, and it's already been taken care of, and he thinks that's a big deal. And then Paul, the passage you're quoting in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul is saying that because I'm forgiven, I still sin, I don't do what I should do, I do what I hate, but grace covers all of that, and there's no condemnation for me. And then he says the glory that's come is just now, the troubles that we have now is not worthy to be compared with what heaven is going to be like. And do we even think like that? And even writing the book, I realized I don't think like that as much as I should. So the book has been a tremendous challenge to me, actually.
Well, I found that sometimes when you write a book, sometimes you learn the most, or when you teach a Bible study, you're the one that benefits from it the most.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about Moses. We've been talking about Paul, but you have 2 chapters here on Moses and, of course, this idea of useful waiting. Then we're going to move on to difficult waiting and really kind of some of the struggle for self-control, which is really important, and whether self-control is even possible, so we'll get into that. And then finally, we'll talk about this idea of powerful waiting and a pathway and really the whole power of choice and this idea of hope of glory that you talked about just a minute ago. So a lot more to cover. This is a book that is now out and about 120, almost 130 pages that you will benefit from in terms of waiting for heaven, freedom from the incurable addiction to self. And it is written by Dr. Larry Crabb, and you can certainly look for it in your local bookstore, but we've given you information about it so that you can get it in paperback or Kindle and benefit from that as well. It might be a great small group study that you might want to pursue as well with other people in your sphere of influence, but I'm certainly convinced that you can read through this and benefit from the great insights from Dr. Larry Crabb. We'll continue our conversation and be back right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Larry Crabb as we talk about his book, Waiting for Heaven, Freedom from the Incurable Addiction to Self. And Dr. Crabb, of course, we've been talking about the Apostle Paul, but let's talk about Moses, because, of course, this takes us into Hebrews 11 and other passages. And really, in a sense, it begins to help us understand, what does waiting look like? I mean, after all, that is the title of your book. And yet it is, I think, important for Christians to understand this idea of waiting for heaven and to actually become heavenly minded and to think about how to endure and to be perseverant in the midst of the circumstances you find yourself in. So help us out with that.
Well, absolutely. Two of my favorite Old Testament characters are Jeremiah and Moses. I'm drawn to Jeremiah because for 40 years he was faithful to God. He was given God's word, and he proclaimed it faithfully for 40 years. Nobody listened, and he had a miserable life. And I'm thinking, God, have you just not promised us to have the abundant life, meaning an abundance of comfortable blessings? And apparently not, if Jeremiah's life is any example. But then I thought about Moses, and he's just a more classic example, more explicitly, waiting for heaven. The passage you mentioned in Hebrews 11, verse 26, where he says that, or the Bible says that what he did was he thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. And him looking ahead there, I think, is a bit of a picture of Moses was saying that I'm going to endure living in this wilderness for 40 years, and even when I get to the end of this 40 years, I'm not even going to get into the land of Canaan. He didn't even get the reward in the earth that he wanted. But this is an example of waiting for heaven. And what he did, it seems to me, and I borrow this from J.C. Ryle's book on holiness, which is a marvelous book where he talks about Moses in ways that I have been stirred to think about. He gave up a guaranteed for life place of power and prestige as a prince in Egypt. He had a good life. He had a great life. Everything was going well. His grandfather was the Pharaoh. His mother was a daughter of the Pharaoh, and he was in a classic position, and he gave it all up because of the faith that God had something better in mind for him. Not only did he give up the power and prestige, but he gave up what the Bible calls the fleeting pleasures of sin. Now, I can only let my imagination wander on that during the first 40 years of his life living in Egypt. What kind of pleasures of sin were available? I imagine a rather large amount, and all those were available to him. Did he indulge? We don't know. But he got to a point where he said, no, whatever those pleasures are, they're fleeting. I want something that's permanent, and I'm going to wait for what God is going to give me. Something he has is better in mind for me than just helping me become a lover of pleasure rather than a lover of God. And then he gave up prosperity. I mean, obviously he had a pretty good bank account, I suppose, being the grandson of Pharaoh. And he said, no, I'm just not going to live to make sure that my bank account is everywhere I want it to be. Nothing's wrong with having money to pay your bills. I happen to have enough money to pay my bills, and I'm grateful for that. But Moses said, but that isn't the point of my life. And if it costs me everything in order to follow God, I'm willing to do that, all because I'm looking forward to the pleasures that are coming. He really made, from a very human point of view, he made some really stupid choices.
Yes.
Talk about that. He chose suffering. He chose misfortune. He chose abuse. The Bible calls it he chose mistreatment. Why would he do that? He wasn't a masochist. He wasn't saying, gee, let me see how bad I can make myself feel. That's not what he was doing. He was saying that the pleasures that are available now really don't measure up to the pleasures I was designed to experience. And I believe my pleasures are somehow in this God that I'm worshiping. And so I'm going to give up these pleasures. I'm going to choose the company of a despised and broken people. I mean, the people of Israel were in miserable life for 400 years, and he says, no, I'm your brother. I'm going to be a part of this, and I'm going to put up with humiliation and suffering. I'm going to put up with scorn, whatever I need to put up with in order to follow God. And if there was no future for him based on doing that, then I think he was just foolish. And I just find that as a marvelous example of what it means to follow Christ at any cost. And if you're blessed with a lot of things, I'm blessed with a lot of things, be grateful for them. but don't call them the ultimate, because they don't satisfy the soul as fully as you want it satisfied. Only heaven's going to do that, so pay whatever price to follow the Lord on the narrow road, knowing that heaven's coming up, and Moses, to me, is a great example of that.
Yes. In your chapter on foolish choices, you talk about, and they all start with the S, to suffering and to social outcast, being the company of despised and broken people, and to scorn and facing reproach and rebuke. But let's move on, because in addition to that, then it takes us into the next section on difficult waiting, and really what you call the struggle for self-control, and even the question, is self-control possible? And you said, well, it depends. Help us out with the idea of self-control.
Well, I talk about wait with great passion. That's one of the phrases that I have at the beginning of that chapter, chapter 8, wait with great passion. And what I go into there is, suppose God said to me, all right, I want you to drum up some passion. It's like, I don't know how to do that, God. I don't really know what it means to drum up great passion, but you want me to wait with great passion. So what are you talking about? Is it possible to have such a passion for heaven that you learn, because of what's coming later, you demand nothing now? And that's kind of one of my key thoughts, at least in my own experience, as I think about heaven. There's so much that I want now, and nothing's wrong with wanting certain things, but the issue is, do I demand? And with some of the things that I talk about there, is it really possible? I think if I had to summarize all that I'm trying to say there, is that there's got to be a vision of what the gospel provides now that is really incredible, and what the gospel can provide not only for me in my relationship with God, but what the gospel can provide in who I could become as a man. And so I think of two things here. I think of what I call the exact center of Christianity, and I base this on John 17, that is it really true? And when I first was pondering this, about 2 years ago, it really caught me in a way that I had sort of known before, but it hadn't reached me in a deep way, and I became very thirsty to have a deeper experience of this, that right now, in the middle of my life now, as a man still struggling with addiction to self, not overcoming that fully until heaven, so even at my worst, I am loved by the Father just as much as he loves his eternal Son. Because I now am in Christ, therefore I'm a son of God, small s, obviously,
right?
Because I'm related to the Son of God, capital S. And understand that when if I get impatient with one of my sons and kind of talk in a bit of a snarky way, or get annoyed with a friend who I want to get off the phone sometimes, I got something else I got to do, and they're going on and talking too much, and I wish I could get rid of them. And those kind of things go on in me that are just ugly. And when that ugliness is very clear to me, at that moment, I'm as much loved by the Father as he loves Jesus. And my thought is, how on earth do you pull that off, Father? That goes beyond description, because your Son never disappointed you. I disappoint you on a daily basis because I'm more concerned about me than somebody else. And that, to me, is the exact center of Christianity, that I'm really loved by the Father at my worst. But then the second part of that is, can I really get a little bit of a vision? I love the word vision.
Right.
Can I develop a vision for what further spiritual formation might look like? What could I further become? I don't want to be premature content. I'm 76-year-old, but a Christian since I was 8 years old. And without any exaggeration, I really believe that I have further to go than I've already come, and becoming the man that I really could be before heaven. And when I get a vision of what it would look like to be profoundly patient and warm toward my wife at every moment, profoundly patient and warm toward my two sons, toward my grandchildren, toward friends who let me down, who has got to really put the love of Christ on display by how I relate. And when I think about what that would mean, it really kind of excites me. I really want that. And then it occurs to me that the more that I live out of my addiction to self, the more I'm getting in the way of the vision of becoming that man. Therefore, I want to learn to demand nothing now and to wait for heaven more eagerly. And with that vision in my mind, and with the reality of the gospel's meaning that I'm loved by the Father fully, that gives me a little encouragement. I'm not sure if it just transforms me perfectly. It doesn't. But it gives me the encouragement, the impetus, and the grace that is required for me to maybe learn to exercise a little bit of self-control. And when want a second piece of pie just because I'm disgusted with a couple of things and I just going to demand a little bit of pleasure now by eating stuff I shouldn't eat. Maybe I can resist that temptation. Maybe I can resist that temptation because it gets in the way of becoming who I am, and it gets in the way of the enjoyment of God's love for me.
Very good. Well, we've been talking about useful waiting as well as difficult waiting, and we've looked at this idea of self-control and vision. But when we come back briefly, I want to talk about powerful waiting, and in particular, talk about this idea of a pathway, because that is going to be really important in terms of is there a pathway to freedom? And so what does that entail as well? It's all part of the book, Waiting for Heaven, Freedom from the Incurable Addiction to Self. Dr. Larry Crabb will be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Larry Crabb with us for a few more minutes as we talk about the book Waiting for Heaven, Freedom from the Incurable Addiction to Self. And we need to, Dr. Crabb, at least get to the pathway to freedom. We want to give people some hope. And what about this? Because you talk about this pathway, what it looks like, and how, in a sense, Waiting for Heaven will give us that pathway to freedom. Talk about that, if you might.
As I got to the end of the book and was rereading all that I had written, it just became very clear to me that no matter how much you have a passionate anticipation of what heaven is going to be like, and no matter how much you want to be the man you want to be, the woman that you want to be, the element of choice is still involved. I have to make a choice to live in a way that is similar to Moses. I got to give up whatever is wrong. So how do I make that choice? How do I claim the freedom that Paul says, stand fast on the freedom that you have? What is this freedom all about? The freedom to choose what you most want within your own soul. And as I began thinking about that, I came up with two categories that began to make a lot of sense to me. Number one, I called it our capacity for choice depends on having an informed choice. And what I mean by that is, do I really believe what I claim to believe? Do I really believe that the quality of life that Christ alone makes possible is available only in Christ? Do I believe that Christianity really is the answer to my deepest longing? Do I really believe that? Does that truth so radiate within me that the choice to go in a good direction really makes sense? It isn't something I ought to do, even I don't want to, but it makes sense. Therefore, I want to do it. And that's one element. And the other element that really has been gripping me a lot is why I helped co-found what my son is now directing. It's called Larger Story Ministry. And the book, by the way, is available through largerstory.com.
Right.
And the thing that I became very aware of over the last number of years, and it's crystallizing in this new ministry, is that God is telling a story that began in eternity past, is going to continue in eternity future. It's never going to get off track. Satan has no power to destroy the story. And that means that the story of his love is ongoing at my worst moment, at my best moment, at my boring moments, that there's a story going on at every moment that is really good. And I want to join that story. And when I realize that story is something I really want to join the kingdom of God and bring in the kingdom of heaven into the kingdom of into earth, when I become aware of that, then my choice becomes informed. It makes sense. And that's one element that is, to me, is a very important part of the pathway to freedom. The second thing I talk about is an influenced choice.
Right.
And all I mean by that is that it's really kind of a simple, but for me it's a profound thought, that I'm aware of so many desires in my heart. My wife and I went out for lunch a little while ago. We wanted to go to Arby's because I wanted a fish sandwich. And Arby's had too long of a line. We didn't want to wait, so we went somewhere else. Well, I've got so many desires in my being, some as trivial as that, and some that are very, very strong. I'd like to be healthy. I'm not as healthy as I want to be. But is there a deeper thirst within me? Does a new covenant, does the gospel reality mean that there's a thirst within my soul that is deeper than any other thirst, and that I really want to know the Lord and I want to be more like him? And I think one of the points that I make there is that we have a wrong understanding of morality. We say, and this is a quote from the book, we sometimes believe that people are moral who live true to whatever is naturally felt to be their deepest thirst. And I take the example of Hugh Hefner, apparently. The thirst he was most aware of was sexual pleasure. And he lived rather consistently with that particular thirst, completely unaware that as a man made in the image of God, the deepest thirst of his image-bearing soul, which obviously he denied, but the deepest thirst of his image-bearing soul had the capacity to be a thirst to know God, to want God, to enjoy God, to be like Augustine, who got over his sexual addiction by enjoying God, because that was his deepest thirst. And until I become aware that there really is a thirst within me, that obedience and waiting for heaven and resisting temptation is not just a matter of white-knuckling it and just trying very hard to be good, but it's releasing what is deepest within me. I really want to be faithful to my wife. Not only that I should be, of course I should be, but I want to be faithful to my wife. I want to be kind to people. I want to put the Lord on display by the way I relate. And that really is a thirst that's deeper than my thirst for personal comfort, deeper than my thirst for good health, deeper than my thirst for a lot of money. I have a lot of other thirsts, but they're all secondary thirsts. And, another quote from Lewis, he talks about put first things first, and I would interpret that to mean at least included your deepest thirst. But first things first, and second things are eventually thrown in. Put second things first, live for your shallow thirst, and you lose out in the first thing.
Yes.
So I just think the pathway to freedom has to be built on believing what the gospel really claims to be true, and believing, too, that your deepest thirst is to know God. That's really in you at any given moment. You're not going to be aware of that deeper thirst until you're spending time in Scripture and thinking about truth and hearing a biblical view on what life is all about. When you get into all that, then sometimes you get a hold of that deepest thirst, and then Christian living becomes what you want to do as opposed to what you have to do.
And again, I love the danger that you mentioned there, because you quote from Jonathan Edwards, of course, Religious Affections, in which he told us that we tend to gravitate toward what affects us and attracts us the most. So we need to be careful about that. But just before we run out of time, your last chapter, I love that. All about me? No. All about Christ in me, the hope of glory. Yes. And really, that's kind of, if you will, the capstone or the summary of what you've been trying to communicate today, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And I do share something that's rather personal, because in the middle of some treatment that I had for gastrinoma, the kind of cancer that I still have, which is treatable, it doesn't look like I'm going to die from it. I'm going to probably die of old age because I'm already old. But I really became aware when I was unable to sleep. I had to be on steroids because of some of the treatment I was undergoing, and had to sleep in the guest room. And I couldn't sleep, and I just was going through kind of a miserable time. And I just became aware. I tell the story in detail in the book. I'll just mention it so briefly now. But I became so aware of something in my life from early days of childhood, wanted someone to be there for me in a way that nobody was. Not even my really good mom and dad couldn't be there as fully for me as I wanted someone to be. Wow. My wife, I got a wonderful wife, but she can't be there as fully as I want her to be, as I want someone to be. And in about 5 or 6 of them in the morning, after not sleeping hardly at all, I just became overwhelmed. I really became overwhelmed. I had one of these great epiphany experiences of God is absolutely for me in the way my soul longs for the most. Wow. And I tell the story that it's the glory of God that I want my life to be about, not me. I got up and all I could do was sing. I began to sing, praise the Savior, ye who know him, and thank you, Lord, for saving my soul. And man, at that moment, hey, I was spiritual. I wish I would have lasted all the time.
Very good.
But I had a transcendent moment of the reality of this gospel story that Christ is in me, the hope of glory. And the hope of glory is coming up, and I'm willing to wait for it. I want to wait for it more than I already do. And maybe I'll learn to demand nothing now and receive whatever blessings I have with gratitude, but not with a mood of course, but, oh my gosh, God, you're so good to me to give me that. But you're not giving me what I most want, but you're going to. It's promised, and I'm going to experience it. That's waiting for heaven. That's freedom from the incurable addiction to self.
Again, the book is entitled Waiting for Heaven. We also, of course, have a link to largerstory.com. Of course, we also have information about the website on our website, pointofview.net, so you can find everything that you need. Dr. Larry Crabb, just great to have you with us on the program. Thank you for an hour, and thank you for writing the book.
Kerby, it was a pleasure to chat with you, and I really enjoy the ministry that you have as well. I know of you, and I know some of what you teach, and I'm really supportive of it, so it's been my privilege to be a part of this program.
Andrew and Steve, thank you for your help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.